10 days had passed since I had made the voyage to extricate Jim and Brian at the senior center. Today is Christmas Eve, a day I'd normally spend with friends or family. It was my first Christmas in my 42 years without a real or artificial Christmas tree present. The first major holiday since our world forever changed. The gifts I ordered online 2 weeks ago would never arrive. No more internet, no more delivery system, no more 9-to-5 work grind. No more stressing about bills, saving for retirement. Now we stressed and worried about food, water, heat, safety, security, disease, and when our eventual luck would run out and death would come knocking on our door. In the beginning, many will think it's all fun and games until they slowly realize how many things we take for granted that you're not able to do without the power grid. Frustration, stress, and annoyance becomes bigger issues as the days go by. When the sun goes down at 4:45 p.m. in December and the realization that the lights are not going to come on sets in, especially with children, you begin to see how bad it could be when roving hordes of gangs rise to the top of the food chain and begin to pilfer, pillage, rape, and murder the weak they come across. Take a look at yourself and ask, how well do I handle tough situations? The odds are you're giving yourself too much credit. In less than 2 short weeks, people have become just like heroin addicts or alcoholics, willing to do whatever it takes by any means necessary to get what they need to survive and satisfy their fixes. Trying times can bring out the best in people, but it can also bring out the absolute very worst. In a post-societal collapse, there are no doctors or psychiatrists available to help you work through the demons that occupy your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs. Coping with the constant stress of violence, famine, disease, and civil unrest is debilitating. We're currently living in a world experiencing dramatic and substantial change, and my group's ability to adapt to this change will determine whether or not we survive. Survival is 90% mental and 10% physical. Experiencing extreme stress and hardships helps us learn our own strengths. Every time I survived and overcame a traumatic and nerve-wracking situation these first 12 days, I learned a lesson about my own adaptability. In a life-threatening survival state of affairs, it's essential to be able to recognize the signs of distress in yourself and in those around you. Common signs are similar to the behaviors resulting from hunger, such as low energy levels and reduced mental abilities, being absent-minded, the inability to make crucial or even the simplest decisions. Daily repeated occurrences of major stressors in our lives now are something we had to accept, deal with, live with, and survive with. The real and palpable possibility of death, injury, illness, famine, and hypothermia was never far off. Any day could be your last in this cold, dark, unforgiving world. There are no more guarantees of living an easy, stress-free life. The only guarantee now is sleepless nights pulling security and wondering if the bump in the darkness is the ghastly, grisly, grim reaper coming to collect your soul. My neighborhood and community had experienced a shocking and alarming number of deaths over the past week. Some from exposure, some from carbon monoxide poisoning, and others from vicious vagabonds hell-bent on ravaging, wrecking, and wiping out whoever they encountered. Martial law may have been declared, but it was hardly being enforced. National Guardsmen and military were busy building and staffing designated warming centers across the 4 million square miles of the country, mainly focused in urban, municipal, mega-metropolitan areas. Those same areas were completely decimated, obliterated, and slaughtered by looters, rioters, and hordes of ill-prepared, desperate individuals, snatching, grabbing, and stealing from their one-time neighbors. As modern society continues to descend into a state of turmoil, food always remains a top priority. People in cities across the country were heading into the wilderness and began hunting deer, raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, birds, and anything else they can find to feed their loved ones. In a country of 333 million people, a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is not sustainable for this vast amount of population. For many people, this was their very first time trying to kill their own dinner. 75% of Americans have never gone hunting in their lives. Absolute chaos and turmoil as thousands upon thousands of complete random individuals with zero experience in hunting stepped into the woods for the first time. Many were out there shooting at anything that moves. Human casualties were beginning to outnumber animal casualties. Those lucky enough to actually take down some game now had to worry about larger groups picking them off and pilfering their prized possession of protein. Wild game wasn't the only thing being tracked in the woods. My local neighbors and fellowmen, who were reduced to relying on their precious petrol in their vehicles to stay warm, now had empty tanks. Careless and imbecilic individuals were so desperate for warmth, they began heating their apartments with their barbecue grills, oblivious to the dangers of the silent killer carbon monoxide. Breathing it in prevented their blood cells from carrying enough oxygen. Their brain and heart suffered quickly. Anguished and distraught parents, just trying to provide a livable environment for warmth, had unintentionally killed themselves and their beloved children. The truth of the matter is, the carbon monoxide deaths and a surging amount of poisonings in many ways was a disaster within a disaster. Plunging winter temperatures and persistent power outages were sending many searching for warmth from dangerous sources. Improper home heating origins from devices like barbecue pits, charcoal grills, and campfire stoves, to practices like running portable generators and car engines indoors was unfortunately adding to the rising number of deaths. Those who didn't die from exposure or carbon monoxide poisoning lost their lives in out-of-control apartment fires, quickly spreading from one unit to the other. Fire can provide heat, lighting, and security, but it can also take those things away. Without the power grid, more people were relying on fire to cook meals, boil water, and in the wicked western New York winter, they were now depending on it for warmth. In the middle of a grid-down doomsday disaster scenario, it was only a matter of time before careless fire practices spiraled into a purgatory of hell. With no 911 service, no operational or responding fire departments available to battle raging infernos, buildings were just burning ablaze until the structure and its inhabitants were reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. 3 days ago, a neighbor ignited a 2-story hellscape by simply knocking a candle over. With no running water, the fire quickly spread, decimating the building kitty-cornered ours. Our measly and paltry 4-pound fire extinguishers were no match for the seething, violent hellfire by the time we heard the screams and smelled the smoke. 6 people tragically lost their lives in that fire. 5 succumbed to smoke inhalation and suffered a horrific and hideous demise. The 6th person, a 28-year-old female who accidentally triggered the event, jumped from her second-floor bedroom window to escape the out-of-control inferno. Badly burned, hair singed and scorched from her scalp, she gasped for air as her top layer of skin continued to shed off in flakes. By now, the ever-dwindling number of neighbors were gathered outside to witness firsthand the carnage and mayhem playing out. Screams and shrieks echoed throughout the darkness, demanding someone to help her. She was suffering immensely and in a massive amount of pain. The only humane thing to do was put her down and end her misery and agony. Looking around at a group of soft, weak, and feeble individuals, I knew that burden would fall onto my shoulders. Pulling out my sidearm and kneeling beside her badly smoldered body, I asked her if she had any last words. She struggled and gasped for air, her lungs inflamed and airways constricted from the colossal amounts of smoke she inhaled. She was in full respiratory failure and dying a slow, painful, agonizing death in front of a dozen or so strangers. Placing the barrel against her now pink, bloody, burnt head, I whispered, "I'm sorry this happened to you," as I closed my eyes and pulled the trigger. I didn't even know her name, I thought to myself. The crowd that had gathered screamed in horror at the sight of me putting her down. Obtrusive eyes now looking at me like I was a homicidal, bloodthirsty murderer. "She was suffering," I shouted. "I had to do what none of you spineless cowards could. Open your eyes. We're living in a ruthless, relentless, ferocious world. We're all going to have to do things we never imagined in our wildest nightmares. You all need to wake up and realize the horrible, ugly, and deadly days that lie ahead. By exposing yourself to the darkness, you don't inoculate yourself against the horror, I yelled. Jim and Jody thought I was on the edge of a mental breakdown that fateful night, but truthfully, I was just disgusted at how fragile, delicate, and frail my surrounding neighbors were. Those somehow still alive wouldn't last much longer. They were incapable of conquering their fears and traversing the deadly and detrimental days, nights, and weeks ahead. Sooner or later, their softness would lead to their expiration. Others left on foot or with near-empty tanks of fuel, hoping to somehow navigate unplowed roads, in hopes of making the 12-plus miles to our rumored warming center at a downtown arena. Trudging, slogging, and trekking on foot would take multiple days to reach the destination. They had a better chance of acquiring frostbite and perishing due to the exposure. Frostbite is the physical freezing of your tissue to the point where it can no longer sustain itself, and then it rots. Then it gets to a point where the skin turns black, and the only thing you can do to save it from spreading is to cut off your fingers or your toes. Or you can wait, and they'll fall off themselves. A debilitating condition I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But I guess when you're ill-prepared and ill-equipped to survive the cataclysmic and devastating doomsday during winter, you take your chances. Anyone who was lucky enough to survive the first winter would most likely be migrating south the earliest chance they got. Mass exoduses of northerners hoping to escape unforgiving, bone-chilling, and miserable winter conditions. Mass migrations also means the government has most likely collapsed and is unable to provide for its people. The planet will slowly squeeze us into packets of instability. Climate refugees who survive will eventually be the roving raiders who descend upon southern states. Hotter climates in the scorching summer of the South and the occupants would be just as vulnerable, though. Imagine Florida in July with no air conditioning. You can try to survive by sheltering in place, but with triple-digit temperatures, modern houses in Sunbelt cities will be essentially unlivable. Most of those communities have elderly people in them. Those people are going to die from heat exposure. No matter what climate you were trying to survive in, eventually the merciless apocalypse was going to challenge and confront you. While others left fleeing for government-run warming centers, Jim, Jody, and I remained hunkered down in our 4-unit, 2-story brick building. On day 4, we had to resort to firing up the Mr. Buddy propane heaters. When the grid fails and electricity is non-existent, your entire focus is centered on trying to stay warm. Light is critical, darkness is depressing. Productivity starts with sunrise and ends at sunset. Not only were the heaters for us, but for our water supply too. What good is a few hundred gallons of clean, safe drinking water if it's frozen? Even in the Arctic, frigid, bitter season of winter, it's extremely easy to fall victim to dehydration. A single 1-pound propane canister would last us approximately 4 hours running on the low setting. I waited a full week from the time I saw the Honey Hole game-changing 2 30-pound propane tanks on the camper stationed in the parking lot before I retrieved them. Even with a cherished and priceless addition to our supplies, we still had to ration our resources. I spent most nights running security solo for 10 to 12 hours at a time. I wasn't comfortable putting Jody in the situation, and it just made more sense for the two of them to spend their nights together. They'd consume less propane doing so, and at the end of the day, it always came down to conserving our primary heating source. With gasoline in such high demand, I'd have to spend the majority of my nights now actually stationed outside, always keeping one eye on vehicles in the parking lot in case petrol-poaching pirates attempted to siphon and drain our reserves. Usually around 6:30 a.m. each morning, Jim would bring me out a boiling hot cup of cocoa, relieving me from my shift. Most mornings, I'd collapse in my tent from sleep deprivation before I'd even finish it. Even though I was both physically and mentally exhausted, My body was trained now to only sleep for 4 hours. By 11 a.m., I'd jolt awake, jumping up sometimes from nightmares, and other times being fearful that today was the day our luck would run out.